Hi, everyone, and welcome to Immersive Insights, the podcast where we explore the world of virtual, augmented, and mixed reality and its impact on our lives. I'm your host for today. My name's Liz Hyman, and in each episode, our team at the XR Association will be talking to experts and pioneers in the field to gain their insights and perspectives on the latest developments, trends, and innovations within the XR industry. From education to policy, to healthcare and gaming, XR technology is literally transforming the way we interact with the world, providing new possibilities for learning, training, creativity, and collaboration. But with these new opportunities come challenges and questions about ethics, privacy, and the human experience. So if you're curious about the future of immersive technology and how it's changing the way we live, work, and play, then you're definitely in the right place. Join us as we delve into the world of XR and discover the immersive insights that will shape our future. Welcome back. To kick off our series, we have a really special guest joining us today, Steven Johnson. He's a best-selling author renowned for his keen observations about the intersection of technology, social trends, and history. And Steven's authored 13 nonfiction books that offer unique insights into the evolution of scientific progress. And he's well known for his ability to bridge the gap between deep scientific understanding and modern day applications. In fact, Steven, when I talk to my friends and family about you and I'm trying to describe you, I often say that you're a historical futurist. So I want to first welcome you. We're thrilled to have you as we explore the future of immersive technology and discuss how XR is changing the way we interact with the world around us. But I wanted to give you a chance to respond to the cognitive dissonance of a historical futurist. Would you like to say hello?
Yeah, well, first off, I'm delighted to be here. And that's fantastic, actually. I've never had an introduction to my work that actually gave me a new job description. And it's a great way of putting it, actually. I hadn't thought about it. I have spent a lot of time writing about the past, it's going back, in some cases, thousands of years, but mostly the last 500 years. But it has always been shaped by some sense of what was happening right now or what was going to be happening in the near future. It's kind of looking at history in the service of thinking about the future. So that's great. I'm going to just put that on my bio going forward. Thanks so much.
Fantastic. I want the royalties. But
yeah, exactly.
Let me jump into our discussion today. So I saw that you wrote a really great article back in 2016 about virtual reality. And that's where I wanted to start our conversation today. I wanted to explore whether or how you've progressed from some of the thoughts and observations you made back then. And particularly, you wrote about virtual reality before the term metaverse had become a thing, right? And VR sets back then were bulkier, they were heavier, they had less fidelity than what we see today. So can you share a quick summary of sort of what you thought back then and where we are now?
Yeah, I mean, that article actually came out of a book, which I think we'll talk about a little bit more, called Wonderland, which was an exploration of the long and surprising history of seemingly exclusively playful behavior, people doing things for no good reason other than it seems fun. That kind of behavior ends up leading to a lot of really powerful innovations in history. That just kind of messing around for the fun of it turns out to be very generative. And there was a whole chapter on optical illusions and the history of optical illusions, which we can get into. And so I was writing about a little bit about the context of VR, and I decided for the Times Magazine to really kind of zoom in on what was happening in VR at that point. And I'm not sure if it's changed too much. There was a really strong emphasis purely on VR at that point, and really not much discussion of augmented reality. And I think that was probably just a reflection of where we were technologically. And I think I wrote that piece in 2016, something like that. So that's 7 years ago. So it was really very much like putting the goggles on and being in an immersive space that I was focused on. And, I think obviously I would say the biggest change since then conceptually has been the idea that space would be populated by other people. So in 2016, it was still very much an experience where there was a kind of cultivated world for you, and you could put on the goggles and drop into that world and experience some kind of spatial reality that was in front of you, but it was not a social environment. It was not some place where you would hang out with other people. And so that piece was really looking at it that way. And obviously, I think the word metaverse is a very old word, but very old, not that old, but it's been around for decades. But it has come to mean, I think, in a lot of people's minds, as a social space, a space where there are other virtual people who you're talking to and engaging with. And I think that's been the biggest change. But I would say it's augmented reality and social VR spaces were the things that just weren't central in my thinking back then.
Yeah. Well, I want to dig into that just a little bit more and the themes from Wonderland, this idea of fun, the sense of fun, right? And I think you put it in a very scientific way. It's about mucking about, right? So
Yeah.
What kind of mucking about do you think is going on today as we get into these more social engagements in shared immersive spaces?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. If you look back at the history of it that I wrote about in Wonderland and in that piece, there were two big. There kind of these wonderful. There's this wonderful period, I don't know, like 250 years ago, where there was this amazing explosion of immersive. I call them kind of palaces of illusion, and they were everything. There's a wonderful example of like the panorama. Which was, the 360-degree painting where you would come in and see a famous military battle reenacted or a skyline view of London or things like that. And there was just a huge number of experiments that happened back then where they would try all these different configurations of ways to like create the illusion of being in some other world. Interestingly, they were not narrative environments, really. They really didn't tell a story. It was just the kind of like the body, the sensory feeling of, oh, I'm in this like other world and I can occupy that world for a bit of time and then go back into reality. And that there was just, again, a lot of mucking around here for, figuring out ways to kind of captivate people. And it was kind of like a Cambrian explosion of all these different possibilities that then eventually consolidated basically into the cinema, right? There are all these different ways of creating people, creating the illusion that they're off in some other world. And then we kind of settled on this one approach and all those other experiments died off, basically. And the other thing that happened in that period is directly related to VR and AR is the invention of the stereoscope, which was one of these great cases where it was a scientific innovation about stereo vision, and also it was really fun. Created by the Scottish scientist David Brewster, who was a genuinely like brilliant scientist who understood, kind of developed a whole theory about how we see the world and perceive the world and things like that, but also developed basically the Viewmaster, and it was a big rage, in the middle of the 19th century of people with these little stereoscopes looking at different worlds in 3D. So that's the kind of like the prehistory of mucking around for the fun of it. And I think to me, the most interesting thing so far in the exploratory world of VR and I suppose AR right now is the part of the technology that's similar to those older projects, which is it's not so much about a story as it is about creating a really interesting space and creating this world that you kind of occupy. And the pleasure of it comes out of being in an interesting environment rather than following a plot, say, in terms of the entertainment side of this all. And the best example of that, and I wrote about this, I think it was like a year ago in my little Substack newsletter, is a kind of a game, I guess you'd call it, called The Room. And I guess it's fundamentally kind of an escape room in VR. And it's set in a historical period. It's kind of, I think you're in London in the 1850s or something like that, or it's Jack the Ripper era, maybe a little later or something like that. And basically you kind of are in this room and there are a set of puzzles you have to kind of figure out. And they're briefly kind of flashes of other people, simulated people, non-player characters, as you would say in the gaming world. But mostly it's just you and the objects of the room, and you can kind of jump from different room to room at different points. And you're piecing together a mystery, but you're also like solving these puzzles, whatever. And I was playing it and I had this kind of extraordinary feeling of this is a wonderful form of entertainment because it's about sitting quietly in a very interesting space and thinking and observing with real intensity. And I thought, how many forms of entertainment are there that really like involve those skills, just like being patiently observant in a complex new space and trying to like notice what's around you. To do that for fun is such a lovely idea. It was almost kind of meditative in a way, when you compare it to, most Marvel movies or most other forms of escapism. And so to me, I think that's where there's going to just be a lot of really interesting work going on, which is interestingly not necessarily so much about the social side of it, although I think it could become part of it, which is if you think about like how willing kids have been over the last 10 years or so to spend enormous amounts of time inventing worlds in Minecraft, just building enormous, entire, cities built out of little blocks in Minecraft. Take that creative energy and put it in an immersive 3D environment. That kind of world building is going to be incredible. Like people will really, there's just going to be, I think, an explosion of kind of creative imagination that will flourish in those kinds of environments. So I'm excited to see what happens on that front.
So I want to shift our conversation just a little bit. I was really captivated on your work about where good ideas come from, right? And I wanted to chat about that a little bit. I think you said, you pointed out a few technologies. For example, YouTube needed high-speed internet in order for it to take off. So I think you call it adjacent technologies. I'm wondering, as you look at XR, and you think about sort of the timeline of adjacencies, where are we? Are we early on? Are we kind of getting to a point where there are adjacent technologies? How do you view that?
Yeah, this idea that one of the key terms from where good ideas come from, that 10 years, 12 years later I adapted for my email newsletter is the adjacent possible, right? So at various points as society is evolving, as science is evolving, as technology is evolving, some new thing happens, some new platform is developed, some new scientific idea gets into circulation. And that development may be kind of solving one particular problem in one field, but it unlocks kind of doors of possibility in other fields, sometimes seemingly unrelated fields. And, the classic example that was in my book, How We Got to Now, is Gutenberg invents the printing press. And it turns out that there are all these people who can't read it. They need glasses to read it because they're farsighted. And up until that point, they hadn't realized that they needed glasses, right? There was nothing in their day-to-day lives that really, unless they were like, seamstresses or something like that, there was not that much where you really needed to look at very small things right near your eyes. And so suddenly there was this booming market for spectacles, which had not really, only monks really had used spectacles before that point. And so then there were suddenly all these lens makers who were making money because of that. And the lens making technology unlocked the possibility of microscopes and telescopes, which then inaugurated a huge scientific revolution, both in terms of our understanding of where we are in space and also in terms of understanding cells and various microscopic parts of the world. So the history of technology and science is filled with that. And so in terms of VR, the question is like, what are the technological breakthroughs that will unlock all this possibility? And I think, I'm not going to say anything that's too shocking here. I think they're pretty obvious. It's really about how, in terms of VR, how light you can get the goggles on your face. Like, can you do all the computation and get the screen, in front of your eyes without any external cables and have it be really lightweight? And, we're getting there, right? I mean, I have some of the later ones. I don't think I have the very latest. And it's so much better than it used to be. There's also just the responsiveness to deal with, kind of nausea and things like that. Like, we're so much better than that. With AR, I don't know. I'm very interested to see what is sitting there in R&D labs around Silicon Valley right now.
I think we all are.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I mean, I think it seems clear to me from afar that there's a path that folks are seeing, that they can that they've been able to kind of create convincing AR like experiences where you really do feel like there's an object in front of you, and it's probably just a little too heavy physically and a little too expensive right now, but you just can ride, Moore's law and engineering efficiencies and battery efficiencies, or all the different things that need to get more efficient or get lighter. And, at some point in the next 2 to 5 years, that stuff can become mainstream. Those are clearly the things that need to be unlocked. I suppose the other thing is, and this is not so much a technological possibility, but almost like a cultural possibility which is, I suppose, largely a question for the metaverse in terms of VR, which is, to what extent do we really want to socialize with avatars? It seems hard to imagine that we would be able to simulate having a kind of face-to-face conversation like you and I are having now electronically, where I can see you in full 3D. It's kind of like a video image of you, that we would be able to recreate that if we each had goggles over half of our face. And so the solution has been, well, that's fine. We'll have avatars and we'll be able to map some of our facial features, and your avatar will do that. And I think that the question is is that something that people will embrace? And the new possibility is more of a kind of a cultural habit that has to develop, of people saying yeah, I love the creativity that I can generate by having all these different avatars of myself, and it's more fun. We can still have conversations and we can get work done, but we can express ourselves in all these new ways. And that's just a giant question mark at this point. I think we don't know whether people will want to do that at scale. So I can't wait. I'm front row seats for trying to decide if that really happens.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, we actually, here at the XR Association, we often do staff meetings in virtual reality, and we are interacting as avatars. But the difference is I have to turn and speak to my colleague to my left, or the sound across the table is different than the sound to my immediate right. So it is sort of interesting how it captivates you. And I think over time, we'll also see photorealistic avatars come into play. And then on the mixed reality side, possibly these holographic moments where we're actually sitting in a room together, quote unquote. So it's coming along. And by the way, your wonderful descriptor of where ophthalmologists, got their start, I think is exactly what I meant by historical futurist, right? I mean, there's an antecedent that gets us to some sort of innovation. The other thing I loved about your writing is that the notion of innovation is not like a bolt of lightning, right? That I think you call it the slow hunch. And you already said, I mean, there's all kinds of historical precedent for immersive technology from the 19th century on. And how should we think about where we are? Everybody's all excited about the metaverse. Some people think we're there. Others think we're, another 5 to 10 years before we really can realize the full potential of immersive technology. And so I'm sort of wondering, hey, Stephen, do we all need to chill and just take it easy and see how this is all going to play out? What's our patience level, and where are we on the timeline of the slow hunch?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways that's a great luxury to have, right? You have a little bit of time to experiment and figure out what the new rules are, what the new possibilities are in these spaces. The thing about the slow hunch is, part of it is I think you get this kind of early taste of a new technology in a raw or unfinished form, but there's something about it that kind of captivates you. I remember in the late 80s when I was in college, I got this program called HyperCard from Apple that was a kind of very crude version of hypertext that didn't really work very well, but I just got obsessed with it. And then 7 years later, when the web came along and there was this other hypertext interface, except connected to servers all around the world, I was like, oh, I know exactly what this is going to be huge. I've been waiting for this. And I think a lot of us have had that experience with early VR prototypes, going back to, I remember reading about the famous Wall Street Journal article that quoted Jaron Lanier about this new technology, virtual reality, which I think was 1989 or 1990 or something like that, a really long time ago. And whether we've read about it or tried it, like it's been a tantalizing kind of glimpse of the future that a lot of us have been chasing ever since then. But I do think that it's nice sometimes to have technology that kind of rolls out at a slightly slower pace because you do get to experiment. And I think, part of what I think we've seen is that we've already talked about is the headsets getting lighter and smaller and the image quality getting better and potentially, the possibility of true augmented reality where you can see the world and some kind of computer image overlaid on it. But the other thing that's happening, I think, that is going to be really a big part of this is what we've been seeing with generative AI and images. So I think it's not that hard a leap to go from, I just wrote a few sentences describing some image that I want to have, and oh my gosh, like Midjourney or DALL-E 2, like just created it for me on the screen. Whatever I say, it just does it. And just take that and imagine you're building a world that you can then explore and that other people can explore. Clearly that is coming, right? I mean, there's just no way that's not in the works in multiple places. And that combination of, people have talked about it as like being like spells, like magic spells, like incantations. I say these words and the world appears. That is, that's something we're still obviously at the very early hunch stages of that, and no one has quite built that yet. But it's one of these points where that is in the works, and it's hard not to be excited at the prospect of that.
Yeah, it sort of builds off another concept that you've put out into the world for all of us to enjoy. I love the idea that, it was the British pubs and the Parisian coffee houses and, these wonderful historical settings where people came together. And because of that, it was like the big boom. They came up with all these great ideas. And some ways, I think that these immersive spaces are like the motherlode of all Parisian cafes, which I don't mind. But, it's going to be really interesting to see what comes out of that. And we talked about it a little bit earlier about, these new worlds, but there's so much more to that, right?
Yeah, one of the things I had written kind of endlessly about coffee houses and the impact of coffee, so much so that I briefly had a sign above my desk that said no more writing about coffee houses because I thought people were going to get bored of it. But, it was those spaces were a big driver of kind of the intellectual activity of that period, more than in kind of the age of the Enlightenment, more than universities or, other or corporate headquarters or things like that. Like the coffee house really drove a lot of the new ideas in that period. And so I'd written about it a lot, but actually it wasn't until I came back to the topic in Wonderland, because that book also had a chapter about spaces, not just illusory spaces like the palaces of illusion that we were talking about. And one of the things I hadn't fully realized is like the first public museums were actually in coffee houses, in a sense, where people would collect these weird kind of, cabinets of wonder, they would call them, Wundenkammers or whatever they were called. And just like lots of weird objects that they would populate their coffee shop with. And then people would go in, and this space was filled with all these curiosities from around the world or on some certain themes. And then they would have interesting conversations in an interesting, stimulating space. And it was the collision of ideas and also the way that the space was organized and the people that made it just really generative. And so that's what I think about in terms of, VR and other kinds of metaverse like collaboration. Hopefully you can get interesting people together who can share a kind of a simulated physical space, but you also have the fun of designing the space so that it's visually stimulating and interesting. So you're meeting in an interesting place. And I think that, that's a whole, it's kind of like a social world architecture. If you can build it entirely with your own imagination and create a place where people can convene that can look like anything, that does not have to even obey the laws of physics on some level, what would that space look like? That's a really interesting kind of problem to solve. I mean, I think we'll still need actual coffee.
I do.
It won't be necessary. It won't be possible to simulate that part of it. But the rest of it is kind of up for grabs.
I love that. And I think, as we close out our conversation today, and you already touched on this earlier in our conversation, early on, you were remarking on sort of almost the contemplative aspects of virtual reality and being able to create something and to have that time and the luxury of that time. But it sounds like really it's that luxury of shared time. And, that may well be the thing that draws people to this technology more powerfully than anything else that we're talking about. And based on your old musings, does that sound right to you as we move forward?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think there's, one thing that comes to mind is funny. I rarely have talked about this, but I play golf, and I've been waiting for golf. By the way, golf is a sport that is best suited for VR because you don't have to run around. You're just kind of more or less standing, and you hit your shot, and then you go to the next place. So and there are already some golf simulators, but one of the best things about golf as a sport is that you play with a friend, and you're walking out in the world, and if you're playing an interesting course, it's like visually interesting, and there's a little competition between you and your friend, but you're also talking, and so there's this mix of like physically exploring an interesting environment, having a conversation, open-ended conversation with an old friend, and some kind of score for what you're doing. And so those three things together is just a really magical kind of combination. And to me, like, you could imagine some version of that where someone has built a world, and maybe it's a third party that's built the world, but you're with some other people in the world and you are exploring it. And perhaps there's a kind of a light layer of a game on top of that, perhaps. It doesn't have to be, but there could be something that is, entertainment in that way. But as you kind of occupy this space and move through it, you're also just having a conversation with your friend or a group of people. And it's like, I guess, it's like going on a hike or something like that. The same way, it's like part of it is that you're in nature and it's beautiful, and part of it is that you're with your friends and you're talking, and that combination is good. And so imagine that where you can do that at any point, sitting in your living room, and the worlds can be even more imaginative than your average golf course or your average hike. And I think that, that's just that in some ways, that's the part of it that, is probably the part of the form that will evolve the most and surprise us the most. That there will be like ways to have a virtual meeting in the metaverse for sure that will look like a conference room, and there will be some projected kind of whiteboard like thing where you can collectively see what's up there, and that'll be great. That's useful. But the kind of going on a journey into a world that someone has conjured up, perhaps using some kind of generative AI, and sharing that experience with someone, that I think that will be genuinely new and just filled with possibilities that we can only begin to imagine right now.
Well, Stephen, I don't play golf, but I've really enjoyed having sort of the virtual golf game with you of friendship and conversation. So I really want to thank you for joining us today and giving us that historical futurist perspective.
It's been my pleasure. And if you ever take up golf, I'm happy to take you out.
Awesome. Terrific. Thanks, everyone. Okay, that's our show, and I hope I get to see some of you in the virtual golf course. But I want to thank you for listening, and special thanks to our amazing guest, Stephen Johnson, and the incredible team who helped put this together. If you'd like more Immersive Insights, be sure to subscribe at Apple, Google, or Spotify to stay up to date on our latest episodes. Until next time, I'm Liz Hyman, and this has been Immersive Insights.